So the last time I had some questions for you about the middle of chapter 3, where we begin the turn of the argument of section 1, where Paul has already, as you can see here on this map, that he's already spent the first 3.5 chapters laying out the problem of our sin, the guilt of sin, and that we're under God's wrath. And now we are right here, we're right at this turning point where he's going to begin to lay out the salvation, the deliverance that God's provided from sin, and which will, of course, be justification by faith in the Son of God's propitiation. So that's where we are on the map in the sort of the overall argument of the book. And the question was, what does Paul focus on when he announces this salvation? So let's read it, just a couple of the lines here. Now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. So earlier he said here, right before this, that by the works of the law, no human being will be justified in God's sight. We're sinners, and no amount of good works can change the sin we've done in the past. That sin is permanently there. We're guilty for those sins where we've knowingly done wrong. So now there's a righteousness that clearly has to be apart from the law. The spilled milk can't be put into the cup. So it can't be by keeping the commandments, the law, that God gives us salvation. But Paul quickly adds, the law and the prophets bear witness to it. And just a reminder that way back here in chapter 1, the opening lines of the book had this same idea, that the gospel has been promised beforehand through his holy prophets in the Holy Scriptures. So now as we turn to this next major section in the book, it's not a surprise that Paul brings up again that the Scriptures, Old Testament Scriptures, bear witness to this salvation. And then he focuses on what? What is his main focus? Well, let's look at where he sort of ends up in this paragraph. He says in verse 26, it was to show his righteousness, meaning God's righteousness. That's in verse 26. And then look way back, not way back, but just before that, in verse 25, it says in the middle, this was to show God's righteousness. So you can see right away that these are the same expression, that Paul is interested in this salvation, that we are saved from God's wrath, which he describes as a gift of righteousness. But he's especially interested in how it shows that God is righteous in the midst of this. God himself is righteous. Now, why would that be so important to Paul? Well, because salvation isn't just about me. It's not just about my salvation. It's also important that God be shown to be righteous. And this is a really crucial idea for Christianity, because all human beings long for two things, but the two things don't go together. The first thing we long for is ultimate justice. We all want there to be final justice. We don't want Hitler to get away with it, and so on. We don't want sinners, guilty sinners, to get away with their sin. Of course, that includes us, but we don't want that to happen. We want there to be an ultimate justice. And then the second thing we long for is we all long for salvation, personal salvation. I want salvation. I want to be saved from that final judgment, that ultimate justice. But how can you have both those things? Well, no religion has an answer to that except Christianity. It's the only religion in history that has offered to solve or to fulfill both longings at the same time. If God were just to sort of forgive us our sins, in the sense of just forget about our sins or ignore our sins and we just go into heaven, well, that wouldn't lead to ultimate justice, because we would have wronged people and there'd be no ultimate justice. So God has provided a salvation that satisfies both longings, and that so that God himself is shown to be righteous. There is ultimate justice, and at the same time, there is a real practical forgiveness of sins. And so how does this happen? Well, it happens through, notice here the sort of legal terminology that comes up. This term justified, justified here, and this word redemption, and this word propitiation, and then of course the word righteousness itself. All of these terms, justified, redemption, propitiation, righteousness, these are sort of the legal mechanisms that were part of the temple worship and the approaching of God in the temple through the sacrificial system, which showed God to be righteous and also offered forgiveness to the individual sinner. So that what Paul's interested in is showing what were the legal mechanisms that allow for God to be ultimately just while still forgiving our sins. And the main idea, of course, centers on this particular word here, propitiation. Propitiation in or by the blood of Christ. So this word propitiation, I guess I'll write the Greek word for what it's worth, is hilasterion. And it's normally translated in the Old Testament as mercy seat. This is the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so the Ark of the Covenant was in the temple, the inner room of the temple, and it was just a small golden box with angels on top of it. And the lid, this thing right here, the top of it, yes, I know those are pathetic angels. Anyway, the lid of it was called the mercy seat. Well, why would you call it a mercy seat, this thing called the hilasterion? Well, hilasterion just means the place of covering, the place of where God is satisfied. Our sin is atoned. But it's called a mercy seat because it's a seat in the sense that it's the throne of God. God is often described in the Old Testament as a throne enthroned above the cherubim. So these two angels here were cherubim on top of the Ark of the Covenant, and God was enthroned above it, because in this ark, inside of it, and here were the two tablets of the Ten Commandments. So this was the government of God, the law of God, right? If it's the law, it's the government. So God reigned, he ruled, he governed from this box, and it's as if he was sitting or enthroned on top of it between these angels. And it was a seat of mercy, right? That God showed mercy. And why did he show mercy? He showed mercy because of this right here, the blood. If you brought blood in and sprinkled it onto that altar from the sacrifice of the lamb out on the main altar, then God from his throne would show forgiveness and mercy, and he could give you the gift of righteousness even though you had been a sinner because an animal had died in your place. Only now in the New Testament, Jesus is that lamb. Jesus has his blood has once and for all in one sacrifice covered all the sins of the whole world, and so there's salvation then through that blood. So that's propitiation. That's the Ark of the Covenant, the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, the throne of God, and how God shows himself to be righteous while at the same time forgiving us for our sins and therefore delivered from the wrath of God. Well, I had a question also about this second paragraph, but I think we've gone on probably long enough already, so I'll just save that question for the next session. And the question is simply, what is this next paragraph about, and how does it relate to the paragraph we just came from? So best wishes, and we'll see you next time.